At some point, one of the Sentinels is going to turn on us. That's not really a controversial thing to say anymore. If you spend 5 minutes in any lore thread, you know that's not a prediction, it's an expectation. Half the community isn't just waiting for it, they're actively begging for it. I actually agree with the first part. I think it probably does happen, eventually, in some form. It's the second part I'm not so sure about, because right now, a lot of that theory has already attached itself to one specific Sentinel, Hsin, and I don't think the story is actually given us a reason to believe that. But that's not even the only thing I want to get into today, because a Sentinel betrays us isn't just one twist, there are a few genuinely different versions of it, and they are not equally interesting. Some of them could actually work. One of them I don't think fixes anything people are actually frustrated with. So today I want to pull this apart properly. Why Hsin specifically became the name attached to this theory, and whether the stories actually earned that read, and zooming out from her, which version of this twist, if any, is even worth wanting in the first place. Okay, let's start with the obvious part. Why does a chunk of the community want a Sentinel to go rogue at all? Two things are going on here, I think, and the first one's pretty simple. Pattern recognition. Build up something as steadfast as the Sentinels for 2 years, and eventually it starts feeling like the story is daring you to imagine the moment that breaks. Fair instinct, just a genre muscle memory more than anything specific to this game. There is a second reason underneath that one though, and it's actually the more interesting of the two. I'm going to hold on to it for later, it matters more than the obvious answer, and I want to get through the how before I get to the real why. So how would this actually happen? There are basically 3 ways this could go, and they are absolutely not equal. Start with the one we've already seen the game do. Corruption. A Trinodian gets to a Sentinel, or it's Fractious, or it's something more human than that. We watched this happen back in Renacita, so nobody's pretending it's off the table. Here's the problem with it though. From a writing standpoint, this is the safe option. Too safe, honestly. It absolves the Sentinel of guilt entirely. It wasn't a choice, it was a corruption. And what you get is a very sad, very good boss fight. To be clear, I think Kuro could deliver that boss fight without breaking a sweat. High stakes, real gut punch. I just don't think it's the interesting version. It's the obvious one. Option 2 is stranger. What if it's not corruption at all? What if it's the programming itself? We know for certain now that the Sentinels are artificial creation, so it's not exactly a stretch to imagine one running some buried protocol that quietly decides humanity is the actual threat. Makes sense on paper too, it fits the new Federation's dystopian sci-fi undercurrent almost too neatly. Except that's a Skynet story, an Ultron story. That framing only works when the thing turning on you is fundamentally a machine, cold logic with nothing else in the room. That's not what the Sentinels have shown us they are. We've watched them care, genuinely, personally care, not execute a directive. A purely mechanical humanity is a virus turn just doesn't fit what 2 years of story have already told us about who they are. Out of the 3, this is one I find the least believable, and honestly the least interesting if it somehow did happen, which leaves the third option, the one I'd actually find compelling. Not corruption, not broken code. A Sentinel who looks at everything, weighs it honestly, and chooses to turn against us anyway. That's not a bug, that's a belief. Completely different kind of story, because now you're not fighting a monster, you're fighting an argument. What happens when someone who's protected you for centuries genuinely decides you're not worth saving anymore? Just describing that one unsettles me a little. To be clear, I do expect the Sentinel to turn eventually, I just don't share the excitement a lot of you have about it. 2 of these 3 paths could genuinely work. I'm not rooting for either one the way it feels like this fandom is. Here's the part I really didn't see coming though. When I actually went looking for where this theory shows up the most right now, it wasn't hypothetical anymore, it had a name attached to it, Hsin. This one actually threw me. I first ran into it in the comments under my 3.5 video. A couple people convinced Hsin's eventually going to turn on us. I went back through everything the story's actually shown us with her and genuinely couldn't find where that read was coming from. I don't have a guess for part of it though. Hsin's built on nine-tailed fox imagery, and in a lot of Chinese mythology, that symbol gets tied to seduction and deception. If that's the cultural shorthand you're reading her through, secretly untrustworthy isn't a huge leap. I'm not an expert here, so take that with a grain of salt, but purely on vibes, that might be where a chunk of this theory starts. Look at what the story actually shows us though, instead of what the symbolism implies, and there's nothing there. If anything, everything points the opposite direction. She helped Rover unlock a brand new power. That's simple on its own, sure, plenty of you could wave it off as not enough evidence either way, and honestly, fair, I wouldn't hang my whole argument on one moment either. So look closer. Some of you have pointed to her attitude towards Rover specifically, colder, more distant than the other Sentinels. When I actually go looking for that in her scenes, I don't really hear it. She's more direct, sure, less reverent maybe, though reverent might be too strong of a word for any of the Sentinels honestly. They respect Rover, they follow them. Hsin's just a little blunter about it. That's a personality difference, not evidence of betrayal. Then there's the line doing the most work here, in the wrong direction. When Rover awakens their new power, Hsin tells them, never forsake this city. I've seen that used as proof she's hiding something. Read it again though. That's not the language of someone setting up a betrayal. That's someone who clearly, deeply cares about what happens to Mengzo. If anything, is the strongest piece of evidence I've found pointing the opposite way. One version of this isn't a total long shot, to be fair. With everything going on around Muyu and the Puppet Master threads since 3.5, there's at least a door open for someone else ending up in control of her, rather than her choosing anything herself. Still a stretch, but a more grounded one than cold calculated tyrant, which I don't see anywhere in her actual behavior. I'm not a mind reader and I could be completely wrong about where this is heading, but based on everything the story's actually given us, I don't think Hsin is the one. She might be one of the clearest examples of a Sentinel who isn't secretly plotting anything at all, which is exactly what pushed me toward the bigger question. If the evidence isn't really there for her specifically, why does the theory exist at all? Why does this much of the fandom wants it, regardless of which Sentinel ends up wearing it? Back to that second reason from Act 1, the one I held on to. A lot of this comes down to something I've been critical of for a while now. Honestly, the one complaint about Wuthering Waves that stuck with me the longest. The core conflict is stale, not because Fractious lacks depth, it doesn't. Real lore there, real mystery, genuine care put into it, that's not the problem. The problem is that the conflict itself barely moves. New region, new crisis, new face representing the same organization, resolve it, leave. The shape never really changes, just the scenery around it. A rogue Sentinel feels to a lot of people like the thing that finally shakes that up. New stakes, new flavor, something that actually ripples through waters that have felt still for a while now. Maybe one more layer underneath that too, and I could be totally off here, but there's the chance a world where none of the Sentinels ever turn just starts to feel too clean, too perfect. And too perfect can read as boring, even when it isn't actually boring on its own. Not a knock on the idea, just a very understandable reason to want the twist. Here's where I actually land though. I don't think a rogue Sentinel fixes what people are frustrated with, not even the best written version of it. A betrayal is an escalation, not an evolution. It raises the stakes on the exact same conflict we've already been having. It doesn't change the shape of the story, it just makes the current shape hurt more. And that can absolutely make for a great episode, a great boss fight, a devastating character moment, not denying any of that. But the actual problem, the fact that this conflict hasn't evolved in 2 years, doesn't go away just because one fight got sadder. If anything, resolving "can we trust him" might close off the more interesting question instead of opening a new one. I'm not rooting for it then, not because it's a bad idea in a vacuum, because even in its best possible form, it's solving the wrong problem. Maybe I'm wrong about all of this. Maybe Kuro's 3 patches deep into exactly this twist already, and I'll be eating every word of this video the moment it happens. But if you're one of the people hoping for this, genuinely ask yourself why. Because you think it fixes something, or because it will just feel good to watch. That's where I've landed. Not it will never happen, I do think it probably will, eventually in some form, just not the fix a lot of you think it is. Now, I actually want to know, if a Sentinel does turn eventually, which one of these 3 versions would you actually want to see? And to be honest, is it because you think it's the strongest story, or because it's the one you'd enjoy the most? Anyway, that's gonna be all from me for this one. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more story discussions like this one. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.